Today, I'm here on behalf of submission because it's gotten a bad rap. Insecure men use it to try to control relationships. The church throws it around like a biblical mandate, often without giving proper cultural and biblical context to the discussion. And many women run from it, thinking about and envisioning their mom and grandma bringing dinner to their husband sitting in his favorite armchair while having absolutely no say in the affairs and decisions of the family. So I want to talk about this concept of submission. Is it biblical? Is it outdated? What does it look like if it is still relevant? What is it not? That's what we're going to talk about today on Relationshots. Welcome to Relationshots. If this is your first time hanging out with us, welcome to the place to get practical relationship advice that actually works in your relationship. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell notification so you don't miss upcoming videos. If you want a free guide to intimacy, hit the link in the description area below. You also see lots of other resources like books, courses, classes that can help you strengthen and grow in your relationship. So today, I want to talk about the forbidden S word, submission, in the context of marriage. This often misused and abused, misunderstood word has caused confusion for a lot of us, so we're going to try to tackle it today. But let me go with the disclaimer first. I do not claim to be the final word on this idea of submission. I'm not the greatest theologian. I'm not the greatest learner and studier of the Greek language and the context and cultural context and all that kind of stuff. I've researched this. I've studied it often because I care about relationships and I have some thoughts on it. But I do not for one instance think that I am the final say on it. So I would encourage you, listen to what I say, see what resonates with you, and study it for yourself. So let's start first with where we get the word from in the context of the Bible. This is a biblical mandate that most people talk about. Paul mentions it in Ephesians 5. Peter does in 1 Peter. So we're going to use a couple of those scriptures just so you can see where it came from. So the first one is Ephesians chapter 5 in verse 22. And here's what it says. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. And 1 Peter 3:1, wives, in the same way, submit yourself to your own husbands so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to really zoom in on the Ephesians chapter 5 passage in order to understand what this word submit or be subject to, as it's been translated, is. We're going to look at the Greek word that was translated into submit or subject to. We're going to look at the context of the entire passage. And then I've got three simple ideas on what I believe submission should look like in the context of marriage. So let's start with the word used that has been translated into the English as either submit or be subject to. It's the Greek word hupotasomai. And so it comes from two words, which tasso and hupo. We're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. But the idea of it is that you are deploying oneself underneath somebody else. That's the idea. It's a military context word of one positioning themselves or deploying themselves underneath somebody else in support of them as they go into battle. That's the context of the word. It has Greek undertones to it. So when you think about wives submit to their husbands, it's not just wives obey your husbands, it's wives deploy yourselves in support of your husbands in this battle that they are battling spiritually. So you could make the technical translation as wives, place yourselves up under your husbands in support, and that would be technically correct, but it would miss the military context of this whole passage and what they're fighting. So let's talk about the context of this letter. Now, if you look at Ephesians chapter 5 and Ephesians chapter 6, so the verses before verse 22 and the verses after verse 22, you see that there is military metaphor throughout it. Ephesians chapter 5 verses 1 through 20 are really talking about how the believer is removing themselves from the bondage of their past life as they step into and fight for new ways of life in Christ. That's the first part. And then you go into Ephesians chapter 6 in verse 10, and here's what it says. Finally, be strong in the Lord. And it goes on to say, put on the full armor of God. So the relationships being described here, marriage and otherwise, are not being described in isolation, but they're being talked about in the context of how to abandon the darkness and the bondage of the past and to support one another as they fight this spiritual battle for freedom. So let me summarize. The Greek word used is a military term that speaks to placing oneself up under, and the context of this whole passage is military metaphor where we are fighting together this spiritual battle to maintain and stand firm in the freedom that Christ died to give us. So it does not appear that Paul is simply talking about obedience when he uses this word that's been translated submit or subject to. Rather, it appears that Paul is admonishing the first century Christian women to deploy themselves in support of their husbands in this spiritual battle. Many of their husbands who were not Christians. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and you see what Paul talks about Christian women and what to do when your husband is not a Christian. So the context of this passage does not appear to be simply wives, just obey your husbands and do what they say. No, it's wives, you need to step into the spiritual battle as a support to help your husband fight, who may not even be a Christian and may be stuck in bondage. And this a military term whereby you're deploying yourself in support of. So with that in mind, let me give you 3 thoughts I have on what submission should look like in the context of marriage. Number 1, submission should be mutual. Let me give you a couple scriptures. Ephesians 5:21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 3 through 4. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Listen, in the first century, nobody needed to tell wives to obey their husbands. That was the cultural norm. Instead, what Paul and what Peter are professing is a radically different, interdependent relationship where husband and wives are submitting one to another. My body's not mine, I'm submitting to you. Yours is not yours, you're submitting to me. Listen, we're in this thing together. You did not need to tell husbands that they had headship over their wives in this culture. But what's being said instead is husbands who have the material power over their wives are being challenged to love their wives, to view them as co-heirs of grace, to live with them in an understanding way, to sacrifice for them. This is counterculture. And then what they're saying to wives, many of whom had non-Christian husbands, is you need to support and love your husbands. Deploy yourselves in this spiritual battle as you fight together. This was a radically different idea that's being presented in these verses. The assumption was, in the Greco-Roman culture, that husbands had all the power, they had all the material, and wives basically had to listen to them. So this is being challenged, not endorsed or supported in these passages. Husbands and wives are being challenged to understand they're in a spiritual battle together and they need to support and fight for one another in this battle. So when you talk about the foundation of a healthy marriage, it is first understanding the concept that submission should be mutual. The second thought on submission is that submission requires initiation. So submission is not this thing where the husband's just the head and he runs around and he tells his wife what to do and the wife just obeys. Now, I don't have time to get into the Greek word used for headship here, which also is translated as source and is not really used in the same context of headship or rulership here, but as the source and leader and initiator. So here's what I want husbands to understand about submission. Instead of the word leadership, I want you to replace it with the word initiator. Husbands should be the chief initiators in the family. That is, the husbands should be the ones that use the word let's most often. Honey, let's talk about the budget. Honey, let's look down and find some goals and where we're going as a family. Let's set a vision. Honey, let's talk about what we want to do with the kids as far as parenting and discipline. Let's do devotions together. Let's work on the relationship. Let's go get help from outside counseling or mentors when we're struggling. The husband should be the lead initiators in the relationship. And sadly, too often, it's the wives who are scheduling counseling. It's the wives who are having to drag their husbands into conversations about parenting and finances and working on the relationship and everything else. If you're going to lead, you are the lead initiator. It doesn't mean when it says the husband's the head, that does not talk about competency or capacity. It may be that your wife has greater abilities and competency in areas you don't, but you should still take the lead. So my wife may be better at running a budget, at keeping track of a ledger, paying bills on time, and she may need to own that responsibility and that role in the relationship, but it should not be on her to always initiate those conversations. I can still initiate the conversation. Let's sit down and talk about the budget. Let me know where we're at, where we need to make changes. Let's talk about where we need to go. So the husband needs to be the lead initiator. So don't think leadership like I stand there and make unilateral decisions. Think leadership meaning initiating the things that need to happen in the relationship. Leadership, submission requires leadership that is leadership led by initiation. So submission requires initiation. And the third thought on submission is not control. I think this is a foregone conclusion at this point, but sometimes you got to say the obvious just so somebody doesn't walk away with their own interpretation of what we've been talking about. It's pretty clear from these passages, the words used, the context of the discussion, that Paul is not saying that submission is about controlling, that the husband is not the person in control who makes all the decisions, who unilaterally decides what he's going to do, when he's going to do, and the wife just has to blindly follow in obedience. Obviously, a wife should never follow a husband into sin, even if he is the initiator of something, because she first has a responsibility in her relationship with God to walk free of sin. But in other areas where the husband is leading the wife, it's not just a blind following, it's a mutual submission, whereby there's a sharing of ideas, sharing of opinions, and coming to a final decision. This is not something where the husband gets to run around going, listen, you submit to me, I'm the head, this is what you do. That's not the true biblical concept of submission. As we just talked about, he needs to be initiating, but he's not making all the decisions in a vacuum with complete control, and the wife just has to sit there and take it. That's not biblical submission. So, just to recap the three thoughts once again, submission is not control. Submission requires initiation. And first of all, the foundation of all of this is submission should be mutual. First, notice Ephesians 5:21, submit one to another, comes right before 5:22, wives submit to their husbands. So what Paul has been introducing is a radically different, interdependent, mutual submitting relationship whereby husband and wife are fighting for each other in this spiritual battle of walking in freedom and no longer being stuck in the bondage of their past way of life in the darkness they used to live in. That's the context of submission in this passage. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comment section below, whether you're in agreement or whether you have a different perspective. Would love to talk about that in a respectful manner. So drop a comment below with your thoughts. If you think this might be helpful to somebody, consider sharing it with a friend, and I'll see you right here next time on Relation Shots.